It was a quiet Saturday evening, the kind that once felt like a refuge. The house, bathed in soft amber light, seemed to exhale a silent calm. I sat in the living room, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hand, flipping through an old photo album with the other. The pictures stared back at me, smiles frozen in time, vacations etched with joy, anniversaries brimming with promise. Each moment had once been a cornerstone of my life, but now they felt like relics borrowed from someone else's happiness, hollowed out and distant. The front door creaked open, the sound splitting the stillness. The sharp click of Amy's heels against the hardwood echoed through the house, a sound I used to find comforting. Her walk was purposeful, each step exuding a confidence that bordered on entitlement, as if the world itself was a stage built solely for her performance. "Babe," she called out, her voice carrying that honeyed edge I'd come to recognize, sweet on the surface but sharp enough to cut. I didn't look up immediately, letting her approach me on her own terms. She sauntered into the room, her car keys swinging in one hand, the other resting casually on her hip. The red dress she wore clung to her like liquid fire, every curve exaggerated by its design. It was the same dress she'd worn on our 15th anniversary, though the memory now felt tainted. A cruel joke played at my expense. "Nathan's outside," she announced, her smirk as sharp as a blade. "Come on, let me introduce you to him before we head out. Trust me, you'll love him. He's way more exciting than you ever were." The words hit me like a gust of frigid wind. My grip tightened on the coffee mug, the ceramic cool against my palm. I set it down carefully, a deliberate motion masking the storm inside. "Nathan?" I asked, my voice low, steady, too calm to be safe. "Yes, Nathan," she replied, her smirk widening. "The guy I've been seeing. You met him at the office party last year. He's waiting in the driveway. We're going out. And I thought it'd be nice if you got to know each other." Her tone was almost playful, as if she were discussing a casual dinner plan instead of her betrayal. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze locking onto hers. "If he sets foot in my driveway," I said, each word deliberate, "I'll make sure he leaves in an ambulance. And if you leave with him, don't bother coming back. You'll regret it for the rest of your life." Her laugh rang out, sharp and mocking, slicing through the tension. "Oh please, Connor," she said with theatrical disdain. "You always make these dramatic little threats. But let's be real, you're all talk. You're too much of a coward to do anything. Go ahead, say whatever you want. It doesn't change the fact that I've already found someone who makes me happy." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You'll see, Connor. When I don't come back, you'll be begging me to return. But guess what? I won't." I stood abruptly, the motion startling her enough to make her step back. My voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge. "You think this is a game, Amy? You've been walking all over me for months. Let me make one thing clear. I'm done. Done with your lies, your smug attitude, and your goddamn disrespect." Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but it quickly returned as she rolled her eyes. "Spare me the theatrics, Connor. You'll be here when I get back, just like always. Face it, you need me more than I need you." I stepped closer, closing the gap between us. "Is that what you think? That I'm some spineless fool who'll keep putting up with this? You don't know me as well as you think you do, Amy. Go ahead. Leave with your precious Nathan. But don't think for a second you'll walk back into this house like nothing happened." She crossed her arms, her glare defiant. "You're pathetic. This is why I needed someone else. You're boring, predictable. Nathan makes me feel alive. What do? Sit here with your coffee and your stupid photo albums. Grow up, Connor." For a long moment, I stared at her, letting the weight of her words settle in the air. Then, I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "You're right about one thing, Amy. I am predictable. But not in the way you think." Her brow arched, unimpressed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm done wasting my breath on someone who doesn't deserve it," I said, stepping back. "Do whatever you want. Just don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." She scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Whatever, Connor. Enjoy your pity party. Nathan's waiting." She turned on her heel and strode toward the door, her steps echoing like a countdown. I followed her to the threshold, leaning against the frame as she opened the door. Nathan's car idled in the driveway, the engine's low rumble a taunt. Nice to meet you, Nathan, I called out, my voice sharp. Enjoy your night. And take good care of her. She'll drain you dry if you're not careful. Amy spun around, her glare cutting. Real mature, Connor. You're just bitter because I'm moving on. No, Amy, I said, my voice calm and deliberate. I'm just done. She hesitated for the briefest of moments, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, before climbing into the car. Nathan leaned out of the driver's side window, a cocky grin plastered on his face. Don't worry, man, he said. I've got this. I didn't reply. I simply watched as the car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. The silence that followed was suffocating, yet strangely liberating. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the empty space where the car had been. Then, I turned and shut the door firmly behind me. The house felt eerily quiet, a hollow shell that once pretended to be a home. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into our joint bank account. The balance glared back at me, $423.15. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Without hesitation, I transferred every cent into my personal account, watching as the confirmation screen pinged to life. You wanted excitement, Amy? I muttered. Let's see how exciting it gets when you can't pay for your little adventures. With that, I picked up my phone and dialed Martin, a real estate agent I'd met years ago. I need the house sold, I said. Fast. How fast? He asked, surprise in his voice. By morning, I replied. As the night unfolded, I dismantled the life we built together, brick by brick, preparing for a future Amy never saw coming. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder, its weight feeling oddly liberating. It held the essentials, clothes, toiletries, and a few sentimental items I couldn't bear to leave behind. Standing in the foyer, I paused, my eyes scanning the house one last time. The photo frames on the walls, the furniture we painstakingly chose together, the kitchen where laughter and love once mingled. All of it now felt like relics of a life that no longer belonged to me. The house was still, eerily so, as though it too had given up on trying to keep us together. With a deliberate motion, I flipped the light switch, plunging the space into darkness, and stepped out the front door. The lock clicked behind me, not just securing the house, but sealing a chapter of my life I was finally ready to close. By morning, I found myself in a quiet diner 2 towns over, cradling a cup of black coffee as I scrolled through my phone. A notification from Martin, my real estate agent, popped up. House sold. Cash offer. Congratulations, Connor. A faint smile tugged at my lips. That was step 1. Step 2 was erasing myself from the life I'd just abandoned. The apartment I had rented was modest but perfect. A small 1-bedroom in a quiet city far enough away that no one would think to look for me. The keys were in my pocket, and the lease had been signed days ago. Everything else, a new job, a new routine, a new life, would fall into place with time. Back at the house, Amy would be waking up to a very different reality. I could imagine her stumbling in during the early hours, the alcohol from her escapades with Nathan still clouding her judgment. She'd find the dining table devoid of the usual breakfast, but adorned with a stark, brutal truth. The evidence of her betrayal and my departure. When she tried to unlock the door, her key wouldn't work. By then, the new owners would be moving in, clueless about who she was or why she was there. Her calls would go unanswered, her texts read but ignored. For all intents and purposes, I was already a ghost. Driving to my new apartment later that day, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, freedom. Amy had assumed her betrayal would break me, that I'd be left groveling and begging for her return. She couldn't have been more wrong. For the first time in years, I felt the thrill of possibility, the world wide open before me. Amy's first call came the morning after she discovered the empty house. I didn't answer. Then came the second call, and the third, each voicemail laced with escalating desperation. Connor, what the hell is going on? Where are you? Why is the house empty? Pick up the phone. Her anger was palpable, but I stayed silent, sipping my coffee as I listened. By the fourth call, her frustration cracked, giving way to something more fragile. Connor, please. I don't understand. If this is about last night. Look, I made a mistake, okay? But we can fix this. Just call me back. I deleted the messages one by one, each swipe on my phone feeling like a small victory. Her calls became less frequent as days turned into weeks. Her tone varied wildly. Fiery rage one moment, pitiful pleas the next. "You're a coward, Connor. What kind of man just runs away? Connor, I'm sorry. Please just come back. We can fix this. I'll do anything." But no amount of yelling, crying, or begging would sway me. She had made her choice, and now she was living with the consequences. Life in my new town was simple but fulfilling. My apartment, though modest, quickly became a sanctuary. The landlord, a kind older woman named Claire, welcomed me with a warm smile and a plate of cookies when I signed the lease. "Folks here keep to themselves," she said. "But if you need anything, just holler." The small-town charm extended to my new job at a local hardware store. It was a far cry from the corporate grind I'd left behind, but the pace was manageable, and the people were kind. For the first time in years, I felt at ease. I even found solace in jogging along a nearby park trail. One morning, a woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail jogged past me, offering a polite nod. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged smiles and eventually struck up a conversation. "Nice day for a run," she said, matching my pace. "Yeah," I replied. "The weather's been perfect." "I'm Rebecca," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "Connor," I replied, feeling the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Our runs became a shared ritual, and as the weeks turned into months, Rebecca's kindness and honesty stood in stark contrast to the toxicity I had left behind. Occasionally, Amy still tried to reach out. One voicemail stood out among the rest. "Connor, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but I'm sorry. I was selfish, cruel, and blind. Nathan ruined my life, and I know I deserve it. Please just let me talk to you. Even if you don't forgive me, I need to say this in person." For a moment I considered replying, but then I hit delete. Some wounds were too deep to heal, and some bridges were better left burned. Months later, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment watching the sunset, I felt a profound sense of peace. The betrayal that had once consumed me was now a distant memory, a catalyst for the life I was rebuilding. Somewhere out there, Amy was likely still grappling with the fallout of her choices, but that was no longer my concern. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was truly living. I reread the email twice, the words dripping with desperation and regret. Amy's mention of Nathan ruining her life felt like poetic justice, yet it stirred no sympathy within me. All I could picture was that night, her smirk, her derisive tone, and the sound of the door closing behind her as she left without a second thought. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling deeply. This wasn't the first attempt she'd made to contact me. The calls and voicemails had tapered off but hadn't ceased entirely. However, this email felt different, calculated, as though she had run out of other ways to reach me. Her plea was clear, yet my resolve was colder. Without hesitation, I dragged the email to the trash, emptied the folder, and moved on. 2 weeks later, as I was leaving work, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Connor, it's Amy. I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but I need to see you. Please." I stared at the screen, debating whether to block the number immediately. Before I could, another message came through. "I'm in your town. Please, just 5 minutes. I'm waiting at the coffee shop near your work. If you don't show, I'll leave and never bother you again. I promise." The audacity of her showing up in my town was infuriating, but deep down, a small voice whispered for me to face her. Not to forgive her, but to let her see the ruins of her own decisions reflected in my indifference. An hour later, I stepped into the coffee shop, scanning the room. There she was, sitting at a corner table. The once immaculate Amy now bore the marks of her downfall. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights. When her gaze met mine, her expression flickered with a mix of relief and fear. "Connor," she said softly, standing as though to greet me. I didn't return her smile. I didn't even sit immediately. "You have 5 minutes," I said flatly, pulling out the chair across from her. She sank back into her seat, hands trembling as she clutched the coffee cup before her. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice tentative. "I didn't think you would. What do you want, Amy?" My tone was sharp, leaving no room for pretense. She flinched but pushed forward. I just needed to apologize. For everything. I was selfish, cruel. I didn't realize what I was throwing away until it was gone. I crossed my arms, leaning back. And what exactly do you expect me to do with your apology? Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I'm not asking for anything, she stammered. I know I can't undo what I did, but Nathan, her voice cracked. He ruined everything. He drained my savings, wrecked my car, and left me with nothing. I'm living on a friend's couch, Connor. Stop. I cut her off sharply, leaning forward. I don't want to hear about your problems. You made your choice, Amy. You walked out that door like I was nothing. Now you want my pity because Nathan turned out to be a loser. Her tears spilled over as she reached across the table, her hand trembling as it reached for mine. I pulled back. Connor, please, she begged, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve it, but if there's even a sliver of a chance. There isn't, I interrupted firmly. You thought you could trade me in for something better. How did that work out for you? Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her regret. I was stupid, she whispered. Blind. I thought he cared about me, but I was wrong. I see that now, and I hate myself for it. I studied her for a long moment. Memories of sleepless nights and agonizing self-doubt swirled in my mind. But with each passing second, the weight of those memories lightened. You don't hate yourself, Amy, I said finally, my voice cold. You hate that your plan didn't work out. If Nathan hadn't screwed you over, you wouldn't be here right now. Her mouth opened as if to protest but closed again. She knew I was right. I don't owe you anything, I continued, standing. You made your bed. Now lie in it. She grabbed my arm as I turned to leave, her grip weak but desperate. Connor, wait, she cried. Please, just give me a chance to prove I can be better. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't shut me out completely. I looked down at her hand, and then into her tear-streaked face. You already shut yourself out, Amy, I said, shaking her off. Goodbye. I walked out without looking back. Her sobs followed me to the door, but they didn't weigh me down. For the first time in years, I felt free. Life after Amy was like a blank canvas waiting to be filled with vibrant new colors. My first step toward reclaiming myself was joining a gym. At first, it was intimidating. The machines looked complex, and the regulars exuded confidence. But I was determined. Slowly, I learned the ropes. Within weeks, small changes in my body and mindset began to show. Next, I reignited my passion for photography. Dusting off the DSLR camera Amy used to mock, I spent weekends capturing sunsets, rivers, and the quiet beauty of my new town. Every snapshot felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Amy had tried to diminish. It was during one of these outings that I discovered a community group hosting town events. Intrigued, I attended a meeting and met Sarah, a woman whose intelligence, humor, and kindness were a breath of fresh air. Sarah and I began seeing more of each other, and our bond deepened naturally. She dreamed of opening a bookstore, and I found myself captivated by her passion and authenticity. Each step away from my past with Amy brought me closer to a life I could truly call my own. For the first time, I was writing my own story, and it was turning into something beautiful. As our relationship deepened, I began to open up to Sarah about my past. I left out the grittier details of my failed marriage at first, but one evening, I found myself confessing something I hadn't fully articulated before. I feel like I'm finally figuring out who I am, I told her, setting down my coffee cup as we sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Sarah smiled warmly, her green eyes reflecting the glow of the streetlights below. It's a good feeling, isn't it? Like starting fresh. It really is, I admitted, a quiet sense of relief washing over me. With Sarah, life felt different. It wasn't just her presence, it was the way she celebrated who I was. Unlike Amy, who had dismissed my interests as trivial, Sarah encouraged me. She joined me on photography outings, sometimes suggesting locations I hadn't considered. One day, as she sifted through a series of black and white photos I'd taken, she looked up at me with a confident smile. You have talent, Connor, she said. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her words felt like a balm, healing wounds I hadn't realized still ached. Her support was a stark contrast to the condescension I had endured in the past. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in my small apartment, Sarah paused while stirring a pot of sauce. She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, her voice tentative. "Of course," I replied, glancing up from chopping vegetables. "You've mentioned your ex before," she began. "But you've never really talked about what happened. I don't want to pry, but if you ever feel like sharing, I'm here." Her kindness and patience made it easier to open up. I set down the knife, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "My ex-wife cheated on me," I said finally. "She left with another guy, thinking he was her ticket to something better. When it all fell apart, she tried to come back, but by then, I was done." Sarah nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "That must have been incredibly painful." "It was," I admitted. "But in a strange way, it was also a wake-up call. I spent years compromising myself to keep someone else happy. Losing her was hard, but finding myself again? That's been worth everything." She reached out, placing her hand on mine. "I'm glad you found yourself, Connor," she said softly. "And I'm even more glad I found you." Months turned into a year, and my life felt more fulfilling than I had ever thought possible. With Sarah by my side, I pursued my passions unapologetically. My photography found a wider audience when she encouraged me to showcase my work at a local art fair. I even rediscovered a love for volunteering, joining her in organizing community events that brought people together. Amy's attempts to contact me had eventually stopped. With her silence came a final sense of closure, as though the last remnants of her shadow over my life had dissolved. I didn't hate her anymore, but I didn't pity her either. She had become a lesson, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd gained. One afternoon, Sarah and I were walking through the park, coffee in hand, when I noticed someone sitting on a nearby bench. At first, I didn't recognize her. The woman had a slouched posture, her tangled hair falling limply around her face. Her once sharp features were softened by exhaustion, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Then her eyes met mine. "Connor," Amy whispered, standing abruptly. Her voice was strained, a faint shadow of the confidence I once knew. Beside me, Sarah glanced between Amy and me, her expression calm. "You look good," Amy said hesitantly, her gaze darting to Sarah before returning to me. "Thanks," I replied evenly, tightening my arm around Sarah. "Life's been kind." Amy's face crumpled, regret and sadness washing over her. She took a hesitant step forward. "Connor, can we talk? Just for a moment." Sarah's hand rested lightly on my arm. "Do you want to?" she asked, her voice gentle and free of judgment. I studied Amy, the woman who had once held so much power over me. She wasn't the same person who had smugly walked out of my life. She was a shadow of herself worn down by her choices. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "There's nothing left to say, Amy. You made your choice, and I made mine." Tears welled in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. "I'm sorry," she murmured, barely audible. I gave her a final glance, my voice calm and unwavering. "Goodbye, Amy." Sarah and I resumed walking, leaving Amy behind. Her presence faded as quickly as it had appeared. "She seemed like she had a lot on her mind," Sarah said after a few moments of silence. "She did," I admitted. "But it's not my responsibility anymore." Later that evening, Sarah and I sat on my balcony with glasses of wine, the soft scent of jasmine from her potted plant mingling with the cool night air. "You seem so calm today," Sarah said, swirling her wine. "If I ran into someone who hurt me like that, I don't think I could have handled it so gracefully." I chuckled. "It wasn't always this way. A year ago, seeing her would have thrown me into a tailspin. But now, she's just a chapter I've closed." Sarah smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." A week later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. Subject: "Thank you, Connor. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say it. Thank you for walking away that day. Seeing you happy made me realize how much I lost. You were right. Our actions have consequences, and I'm living with mine. I hope you continue to find happiness. You deserve it. Amy." I stared at the email for a moment before deleting it. No response was needed. Not long after, Sarah and I took a weekend trip to the countryside. As we stood at the summit of a scenic trail, looking out over the sunlit valley, Sarah turned to me. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't moved here?" she asked. Her cheeks flushed from the hike. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But then I remind myself that everything, good and bad, led me to this moment. To you." She smiled, her eyes shining. "I'm glad you ended up here." "Me too," I said, pulling her close. For the first time, my past no longer defined me. My future was limitless. And with Sarah by my side, I was finally living the life I deserved.